They called her Crazy Viv at first, and they said it the way people say things they want to believe are harmless. Not shouted across the street, murmured over coffee, passed between neighbors like a coin worn smooth from too much handling. Her real name was Vivian Cross, but in Harrow Flats, Wyoming, a nickname had a way of outlasting the person who gave it. The summer of 1887 was the kind of summer that made people forget winters existed. The grass on the flats ran golden green for miles. The cattle were fat. The evenings were long and warm. And on Friday nights, the saloon on Fletcher Street spilled laughter out its doors until well past dark. It was the kind of summer that made a man feel the world was fundamentally in his favor. Vivian Cross was not having that summer. She was 42 years old, 14 months a widow, and every morning she woke before dawn and went to work on something that the rest of Harrow Flats had decided without much deliberation was either a cry for help or a sign of a broken mind. She hauled stone. She scraped clay from the creek bank and packed it into a wooden bucket. She dragged rough-cut timber up a rocky slope on a sled she had built herself from salvaged boards. She worked without asking for company and without apologizing for the noise. What she was building was a home inside the bluff, 1 mile north of town where the land pushed upward into a long shelf of pale gray rock. There was a cave that the people of Harrow Flats had ridden past for decades without a second look. It was wide enough for several rooms, the ceiling arched high enough that a tall man could stand without stooping, and a natural fissure ran up through the rock toward open sky, a ready-made chimney that no carpenter had planned. Most importantly, the cave faced southeast. The bluff behind it rose steeply to the north and west, and when the prevailing wind came driving down from the mountains, it struck that wall of rock and split apart, rushing past the cave entrance on both sides rather than pouring straight through it. Vivian had noticed all of this. She had been noticing it for most of a year. Her father had been a stonemason in Pennsylvania, a hard-handed man who talked more to rock than to people, but who occasionally said things worth remembering. One of those things had to do with the old miners who worked the deep shafts in winter. They did not go home when the cold came, her father said, because home was a wood-frame shack that breathed cold air in through every joint. They stayed near the rock. Stone held the heat of the day and gave it back slowly through the night, hour by hour, long after a fire had burned to ash. Wood forgot warmth the moment the flame died. Stone remembered. Vivian had carried that piece of knowledge with her from Pennsylvania to Wyoming, the way some women carry a good knife or a family photograph. She had never expected to use it. Then Edmund died. His name had been Edmund Cross, and he had been a blacksmith of modest skill and considerable patience, a man who never raised his voice and always smelled faintly of iron and wood smoke. He had loved Vivian in the plain, steady way of a man who did not need to announce things to believe them. They had been married 11 years. They had been content. Their house was a wood-frame structure at the south end of town, 2 rooms aloft, a porch that leaned slightly to the left. In the 3 years before Edmund died, it had developed a gap along the north wall where the boards had warped and separated. Cold air found that gap every winter and moved through the house like an uninvited tenant. Edmund had noticed it. He had mentioned it. He had said more than once that he would fix it before the cold set in, and then summer would arrive and the urgency would dissolve in the warmth and the gap would wait another year. The last entry in his journal, written in the strong, even hand he used when he felt well read, "Fix the gap in the north wall before March. Do not let Viv get cold again." He wrote it in October. By January, he was dead. It was not the gap alone that killed him. It was the sickness that moved through town that winter, the fever that took 3 others before it finished. But Vivian knew with the quiet certainty of someone who has had months to think about nothing else that a man sleeping in a cold room with a compromised body does not have the same chances as a man sleeping in a warm one. Edmund had spent 3 winters in a house that breathed cold air through its walls. When the fever came, he had nothing left to fight it with. She sat with him the last 2 nights. She held his hand while the stove ticked and cooled. She had already done her crying, 2 weeks of it alone in the kitchen at 4 in the morning while he slept. By the time he actually left, she was dry. People at the funeral remarked on how composed she seemed and drew their own conclusions, and their conclusions were wrong. In the months after she sold Edmund's tools and paid off the remaining debt on the house, then she began walking north. Not aimlessly. She walked to the bluff. She stood at the cave entrance and looked at the ceiling and the walls and the way the rock faced away from the worst of the weather. She crouched and ran her hand along the stone floor and felt how cool it was, and below the cool, how solid, how permanent, how entirely unlike the warped and breathing boards of a wood frame house. She went back the next day and the day after that. By May, she had made a decision, and by Nora she was working. She bought nails and a single cast iron stove from Silas Hewitt's store on a Tuesday morning, paid in cash, and was back on the road before Hewitt had finished writing out the receipt. She hired 2 ranch hands from the Dawson spread for half a day to help her set the main crossbeam at the cave entrance. She paid them fairly, thanked them briefly, and sent them home the moment the beam was seated. She did not ask them what they thought of the project. She had no interest in that conversation. The frame of the door took her 4 days. She worked the wood herself with a plane and a draw knife, fitting the planks together until the door hung true and swung open without dragging. It opened inward, which mattered. An outward opening door could be held shut by drifted snow. An inward opening door could always be pushed free. She thought about things like that. She lined the interior walls with timber and packed the gaps with clay she had collected from the creek. She smoothed the clay with her wet hand and let it dry in sections, going back to each section and smoothing again until the surface was as firm as dried earth. She partitioned the space into 2 rooms with rough timber dividers, one for sleeping and one for living, and she left the center open. A person walking in might have thought she had simply not gotten around to furnishing the middle. That was not the reason she left it open. She was counting on needing the space. She did not say that to anyone. She just built as if someone might need it. The chopping took longer than anything else. She had 2 axes, one sharp and one dull. She used the sharp one in the morning when her arms were fresh, taking it until the handle vibrated up through her wrists in a way that told her the edge was starting to turn. Then she switched to the dull one for the smaller branches and the splitting work. She stacked the wood on a platform she had built inside the cave mouth off the ground, under the overhang, where rain and snow could not reach it. She stacked it in rows tight and even, and when she was done stacking, she counted every piece. She counted because Edmund had felt like they had enough. He had looked at their wood pile in October and said it looked fine, and she had nodded and believed him, and it had not been enough. Numbers did not lie the way feelings did. The morning she rode into town to arrange for the stove to be delivered, she almost made it to Hewitt's without incident. Almost. Reverend Cyrus Doane caught her beside the water trough on Main Street. He was 58 years old, white-haired, with the careful manner of a man who had spent decades learning to say difficult things in a way that sounded like kindness. In Harrow Flats, he was generally regarded as a good man. Vivian was not in the mood to argue with that assessment. She simply had no patience for what he was about to say. "Vivian?" He removed his hat, as though calling on someone in grief, which in his mind she supposed she still was. "I've been meaning to speak with you." "Reverend." She kept moving toward the store. He fell into step beside her. "I'm concerned about you. This project of yours, living out on the bluff alone, it isn't what a woman in your situation needs. The congregation has room. I have spoken to several families who would be glad to offer board until you find your footing again." "I have my footing." "Vivian." He lowered his voice to the register he used for hospital visits. "You've been through a tremendous loss. No one would blame you for not being entirely yourself. But a widow living alone in a cave, people are going to talk." She stopped walking and looked at him directly. "People talked when I was living in a house with my husband, Reverend. People in this town have been talking since before I gave them anything to talk about." He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I only mean that perception matters. What you're doing looks like, well, it looks like you aren't well." She looked at him for one long moment. "Then people are looking at the wrong thing." She went into the store. She heard later through the reliable channel of Mabel Whitmore, who ran the boarding house and collected information the way other women collected china, that Reverend Doane had begun mentioning Vivian in passing conversations, noting with evident sadness that poor Mrs. Cross had never quite recovered from losing Edmund, that he had the congregation keeping her in their prayers. In a town of 200 people, that kind of pastoral concern had only one practical effect. By July, half of Harrow Flats believed Vivian was suffering from some form of grief-induced instability. The other half had been told the same thing, but had not yet decided whether to believe it. Vivian heard some of this. She kept chopping. The stove arrived in a crate so large that the whole of Fletcher Street came outside to look at it. It was a good stove, heavy cast iron, with a firebox deep enough to take a full-length log, and Vivian had saved for it through the better part of a year. The drayman who delivered it to the base of the bluff sat on his wagon seat and watched her examine it with the expression of a man watching someone do something inadvisable. "You sure you want this thing way up there?" he asked. "Yes." He shook his head slowly. "Lady, you are either brave or out of your mind." She smiled without showing teeth. "Could be both." Installing the stove took 2 days in language she did not ordinarily use. The stovepipe had to be fitted to the rock fissure above it with clay packed and repacked until no thread of smoke escaped into the room. She tested it with small fires, first watching the smoke rise and vanish upward through the crack in the ceiling. On the third small fire, she finally sat back and watched it burn straight and even with the draft, pulling clean, and the room warming the way a room should warm from the inside out. She put her hand near the stone wall and held it there. The rock was warmer than the air outside. By morning, she knew it would still be releasing that warmth long after the fire had been banked down for the night. That was the whole point. That was why she was here and not in the wood frame house at the south end of town. She took Edmund's journal from her coat pocket and set it on the shelf she had built beside the stove. Opened it to the last page. Read the last entry one more time. Then she made herself a cup of coffee and sat in the warmth she had built and let herself feel for the first time in 14 months that she had done something right. Harlan Steed had a ranch 2 miles east of town, 600 acres of decent grazing land, 400 head of cattle, and a reputation for saying out loud what other men only thought. He was 48 years old, physically large, fundamentally honest, and in possession of a certainty about how the world worked that had not yet been tested in any way that mattered. He was not a cruel man. Vivian understood that even then. He was something more common and in some ways more difficult to argue with. He was a man who had never really lost anything, and who had therefore never learned the difference between confidence and ignorance. He found her that afternoon outside Hewitt's store loading sealed tin boxes onto her wagon. Flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, enough for months stacked in rows. He crossed the street with his thumbs in his pockets, curious rather than hostile. "Mrs. Cross," he said, looking at the boxes, "you preparing for a war somewhere?" "For winter." He glanced at the scheme. It was a blue and golden afternoon in mid-July. "Winter here isn't anything to fuss over this much." She did not look up from her work. "Winter last year took my husband." He opened his mouth. He stood there for a moment with it open, and nothing coming out, and she watched his face go through something she recognized, the small, involuntary recalibration of a man who has just said something in the wrong room. Then the moment passed. He recovered his footing the way men like Harlan Steed always recovered their footing, by deciding the comment had not landed as hard as it felt. He shook his head with a short, quiet laugh and walked on. Vivian watched him go. She felt no anger. That was the part she could not entirely explain even to herself. She watched Harlan Steed walk away, and she felt something closer to recognition, because she had been that person once. She had nodded along when Edmund said the woodpile looked fine. She had let herself believe that feeling safe was the same as being safe. The difference between her and Harlan Steed was not intelligence or character. It was simply that she had already paid the price for the lesson he had not yet learned. She hoped he would learn it some other way. She did not count on it. That evening, through the open window of the saloon, she heard his voice above the others. "You see what Viv Cross had loaded on her wagon. She's provisioning for the end of the world." Laughter. Another voice. "Give her a few weeks, she'll be selling tickets to the cave." More laughter. She was a quarter-mile away, walking back toward the bluff with her wagon, and the wind was carrying the sound in exactly the wrong direction. She kept walking. Sheriff Amos Burrell was in the saloon that evening. He was 49 years old, lean and deliberate in the way of men who had learned to move carefully through difficult situations, and he did not laugh at Harlan Steed's joke. He stared into his glass of rye and thought about the winter of 1880 in Dawson County, Nebraska, which he had spent as a deputy sheriff and which he had not spoken about since leaving the territory. He thought about 3 families. He thought about a farmhouse with a collapsed roof and an unlocked door and what had been inside when they pushed it open in March. He thought about how the snow had not even gotten through because the cold had done its work first quietly in the night, in a house that the family had believed was adequate. He did not say any of this to Harlan Steed. He was not sure why. He finished his drink and walked home and told himself he would speak to someone about the woodpile situation in the morning. He did not do it in the morning either. October came with the first light frost, which lay across the grass until mid-morning and then disappeared as though it had never happened. Harrow Flats did what it always did, patched a few roofs, stacked some wood, and resolved to do more tomorrow. Tomorrow was a comfortable word. It implied that today's preparations were sufficient and that there would always be more time. Vivian did not use that word. One afternoon, she was riding back from the bluff when she passed the house of Nora Calloway, a young woman of 24 whose husband worked the timber camps north of town and was not expected back until November. Nora was standing on her front porch looking up at her own roof with the expression of someone who has just discovered a problem they do not know how to solve. A section of the east-facing boards had warped and left a gap wide enough to see through. Vivian stopped her horse. Nora had a 6-week-old baby on her hip and a look of tired helplessness that Vivian had worn herself in different circumstances. She did not ask permission. She climbed down from the wagon, took a spare board from the flatbed, and went up the ladder that was leaning against the porch rail as though it had been placed there specifically for someone else to use. She fixed the gap in 20 minutes. It was not a permanent fix, and she knew it. When she climbed down, Nora was looking at her with an expression that mixed gratitude and uncertainty in equal parts. "Thank you," she said. "Mrs. Cross, I heard people say—" "I know what people say." Nora looked down at the baby. "Is it true what you're building out there?" "Yes." "Why so much? Why all the extra space?" Vivian looked at the baby, at the patched roof, at the sky which was high and blue and deceptively peaceful. Then she looked at Nora. "Because I was wrong about something important once, and it cost me more than I can tell you. When you need somewhere to go, you'll know where to find it." She climbed back on the wagon and drove north. Nora stood on her porch and watched her go until the wagon was out of sight. She had heard the stories everyone had, the ones about Crazy Viv and her cave and her boxes of provisions and her ridiculous stove. She had believed them, or at least she had not disbelieved them, which in a small town amounted to the same thing. Now she stood holding her baby on a porch below a patched roof and thought about a woman who had come to her without being asked and climbed a ladder and fixed something that needed fixing and then driven away without wanting anything for it. She thought about who exactly was the one not making sense. In the saloon that Friday, de Harlan Steed was in good spirits. He bought a round for the house and said loud enough for the room to hear, "If it gets bad enough this winter, we can all go sleep in Viv Cross's cave. 100 people in a hole. Can you picture it?" The room laughed. Someone said they'd have to wash their hands first. Someone else said she'd probably make them chop wood to earn their keep. Hattie Finch, who worked the counter at the dry goods on Tuesdays and knew everyone's business without being asked, laughed along with the rest of them, and then felt for a moment she could not explain, slightly ashamed of herself. Amos Burrell sat at the far end of the bar and did not laugh. He was thinking about Nebraska again, about the distance between a man's certainty and what the cold actually intended to do. He looked at the faces in that room, good faces, the faces of people he had known for years, and he felt something move in his chest that was not entirely comfortable. He thought about Vivian Cross on the bluff, with her wood pile and her sealed tins and her cast iron stove. He thought about the space she had left in the middle of the cave, the open floor with no furniture on it, and he thought about how odd it was that he had noticed that detail and could not stop turning it over. A woman who expected to be alone would not leave room for a crowd. He put his glass down and walked home in the October dark and stood on his porch for a long time looking north toward the bluff where no light was visible and where he was quite sure Vivian Cross was still working. November arrived without announcing itself. One morning the frost did not melt by mid-morning. It simply stayed white and indifferent, and by afternoon the wind had a new quality to it. Not the lazy push of autumn, but something with intention behind it. Something that found the gap between a man's collar and his neck and worked its way in. In Harrow Flats, people noticed and then decided not to notice too much. There was a particular kind of courage that looked exactly like denial, and the people of that town had practiced it for years. Vivian noticed the change from the mouth of the cave. She stood with her coffee in the early dark and watched the frost hold on the grass below the bluff, and felt the wind split against the rock behind her and go rushing past on both sides just as it always did, harmless and divided. She went back inside. She put 2 logs on the fire and crossed one more day off the count she kept on a scrap of paper tacked to the timber wall. She was not counting down to something, she was counting toward it. Silas Hewitt opened his storage room on the second Monday of November to do what he did every fall, which was to count his reserves and feel the comfortable weight of adequate preparation. He moved the flour sacks to the left side as he always did, stacking them in the order he would use them. He got to the end of the row and stopped. He counted again. The number did not improve. He had sold more than he had accounted for over the summer. A good summer, everyone said so, more families passing through on the road west, more cash in the till, More reasons to reorder later rather than sooner. He had told himself he would reorder in September. He had been busy in September. The sacks in front of him now were roughly half what he needed to carry the town through a hard winter. He stood in the doorway of his storage room for a long time. He was 55 years old and had run the store for 19 years and had never faced this particular arithmetic before. He told himself the winter might be mild. He told himself the supply wagon from Cheyenne was due in 6 weeks. He told himself a lot of things, and then he shut the storeroom door and went back out to the counter and said nothing to anyone. Amos Burrell happened to be walking past the alley beside the store at that moment and caught a glimpse of Hewitt's face as the man came through the storeroom door. It was the face of someone who has just seen a number they cannot afford to share. Burrell slowed his walk. He thought about stopping and asking. He kept walking instead. He would think about that moment for a long time afterward. The first real blizzard came on a Saturday in late November. It arrived before dawn, and by the time people in Harrow Flats woke up and looked out their windows, the world had been reduced to a white moving wall. The storm held for 2 days. People stayed inside and told themselves it was fine. This was normal. Winter always did this, and when the wind finally dropped and the sky cleared to a hard, bright blue, they opened their doors and stepped out into knee-deep snow and laughed with the relief of people who have just been reminded that they are in fact still alive. Vivian rode into town that afternoon for lamp oil. She passed the wreckage of Nora Calloway's east-facing porch roof, which the storm had peeled back and deposited in the yard like a piece of discarded paper. The temporary repair she had made in October had held through exactly one storm, which was precisely what she had told Nora it would do. The house was empty. The door was open. Vivian stopped her horse and looked at the open door for a moment. She had told Nora where to go. She could only hope Nora had listened. She bought her lamp oil from Hewitt, who was quiet in a way she recognized, a man carrying arithmetic he could not put down, and rode back toward the bluff. The laughter from the recovered streets of Harrow Flats followed her for half a mile. Nora Calloway had listened. She had been awake when the porch roof began to tear loose, sitting up with the baby in the dark, while the storm hammered at the boards above her. When the first section went, the sound was not a crack but a long groan, like something alive giving up. She wrapped her son in every piece of fabric she owned that was clean and dry, tied him in against her chest under her coat, and walked out into the storm. She tried her neighbors first. The family to the left had their hands full with a chimney that was barely drawing. The family to the right did not answer, whether from fear or exhaustion, she could not tell. She stood on their porch in the dark, with the wind driving snow against her back, and her baby pressed against her sternum, and she thought about a woman on a wagon in October who had climbed a ladder and fixed something without being asked. When you need somewhere to go, you'll know where to find it. She went north. The mile to the bluff was the longest mile Nora Calloway had ever walked. She could not see more than a few feet in front of her, and twice she stopped because she was no longer certain she was moving in the right direction. Both times she found the slope of the ground under her feet and corrected her course and kept going. The baby had stopped crying somewhere in the middle of that walk. The silence frightened her more than the crying had. When the door of the cave opened and the heat came out like a living thing, Nora Calloway sat down in the snow outside the entrance and could not stand back up until Vivian came out and put a hand under her arm and brought them both inside. Vivian did not ask questions. She took the baby first, unwrapped him, held him against her own chest, and checked his breathing, while Nora stood shaking in the doorway. The baby's lips were pale but not blue. His breath was fast and shallow, but it was there. "He's breathing," Vivian said. "Come in and close the door." Nora came in and closed the door and then sat down on the floor because her legs stopped working. She was 24 years old and she had just walked a mile in a blizzard with a 6-week-old child, and she wasn't crying because she did not have the energy for it. Vivian handed her a cup of broth so hot it burned her fingers through the tin, and she held it anyway. "You said I'd know when I needed to come," Nora said finally. "You did know." "I almost didn't." Vivian looked at her steadily. "But you did." This was the first time anyone in Harrow Flats had come to Vivian's door voluntarily by choice rather than disaster. Nora had believed her before the emergency, not during it. Vivian did not say this out loud. She just built up the fire and let the rock walls do what rock walls did, and by morning the baby was warm and sleeping, and Nora Calloway had become the first person in Harrow Flats to understand something the rest of the town would learn the hard way. The informal meeting happened on a Thursday evening in mid-December at the saloon, which was the closest thing Harrow Flats had to a town hall. Harlan Steed had called it, or near enough, spreading the word through his ranch hands that he thought people ought to talk about the woodpile situation before it became a woodpile crisis. The room filled quickly. 30 men, a few women, the smell of wet wool and wood smoke. Harlan stood near the bar and spoke plainly, which was what people respected about him. They needed to organize a cutting party. 10 men 2 days go up into the timber above the flats and bring back enough wood to last through February. Start this week. People were nodding. It was a reasonable plan. Harlan Steed was a reasonable man. Reverend Cyrus Doane stood up. He stood with the particular posture of a man accustomed to being listened to. Hands folded, voice calibrated to carry without straining. He spoke about steadiness, about not allowing anxiety to govern decisions, about the congregation's history of weathering difficult seasons through faith and mutual support. He said with the measured certainty of someone who believed he was being helpful, that organizing emergency woodcutting parties would create a sense of panic in the community that was more dangerous than any cold front. The room was quiet for a moment. Harlan Steed looked at the Reverend. His jaw moved slightly, working through something. "Reverend," he said, "I respect you. I mean that. But God does not chop wood for me." The room went very still. Doane's expression did not change. "Harlan, I'm not suggesting we be passive. I'm suggesting we be measured. Panic spreads faster than cold. I'm not panicking." Harlan's voice was flat and certain. "I'm cold. My wife is cold. My children are cold. That's not panic, that's a fact." Doane sat down slowly. The conversation moved on. The woodcutting party was organized for the following Monday. People filed out into the December dark feeling like they had accomplished something. Burrell sat at the far end of the room and watched all of it and did not speak. He waited until the room was nearly empty, and then he walked over to Harlan, who was pulling on his coat. "Steed." Harlan looked at him. "That cutting party Monday. I'm going with you." Harlan studied him. "You don't need to. It's handled." "I want to tell you something on the road," Burrell said, "about a winter I was in before I came here. You should hear it before you decide how prepared you are." Harlan held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "Monday, then." They rode out before sunrise, 8 men, including Burrell and Harlan Axes in a 2-horse sled. On the road into the timber, Burrell told Harlan about Dawson County in 1880. He did not dramatize it. He told it the way a man tells a thing he has carried a long time and wants to set down carefully. 3 families, a farmhouse with a gap in the roof that the husband had been meaning to fix. The way the cold worked, not in a rush, but patiently hour by hour through the night, finding every place where the house was less than it should have been. Harlan rode without speaking. The husband had told his wife in October it was fine, Burrell said. Told her he'd fix it properly in spring. He was a good man. He believed what he said. Harlan looked at the road ahead. "I'm not telling you to frighten you," Burrell said. "I'm telling you so you know what the margin actually is." They did not speak again for the better part of a mile. On the road home, sled loaded, they came around the back corner of Hewitt's store and found Silas Hewitt in the alley moving sacks with the hurried sideways motion of a man who does not want to be seen doing what he is doing. Burrell stopped his horse. Hewitt looked up. The arithmetic was written all over his face, plain as newsprint. Burrell said simply, "How short are you?" Hewitt looked at Harlan, then back at Burrell. He told them. The number was worse than either of them had prepared for. Harlan stared at the man for a long moment. He was not angry, or not exactly angry. He was doing the calculation, running the number against the faces of the families he knew, and watching the result come back badly. "Why didn't you say something?" Harlan asked. Hewitt spread his hands. "I didn't want to start a panic." Harlan opened his mouth and then closed it. He stood in the alley with the cold settling around him, and he thought about what Amos Burrell had just told him on the road about a good man who had told his wife things were fine because he believed it and because saying otherwise was uncomfortable. He thought about Vivian Cross's wagon loaded with sealed tins in July and how he had laughed. He did not say anything to Hewitt about Vivian Cross. He did not say anything about himself either. He just looked at the sacks and then at Burrell and said, "We need to figure out what we actually have. All of it, before the week is out." Burrell nodded. "I'll start tomorrow." The real cold arrived in the second week of December, the way serious things often arrive quietly and without ceremony. The temperature dropped after midnight, and by morning the water in the street troughs was solid. By afternoon, it was the kind of cold that changed the air's texture, that made breathing feel like drawing something through cloth. Silas Hewitt's thermometer on the store wall pushed past the bottom of its scale, and a hairline crack appeared in the glass, and Hewitt stood outside looking at it with the expression of a man whose last hope of denial has just shattered in front of him. Vivian came by that afternoon heading back to the bluff with a final load of supplies. "It's broken," Hewitt said, gesturing at the thermometer. Vivian glanced at it without stopping. "It's not broken." He turned. "What?" She stopped walking, looked at him directly. "It's not broken, Silas. It's just showing you a number you weren't ready for. People forget, but the cold doesn't." She moved on. Hewitt stood on the sidewalk in the diminishing afternoon light and watched her go and thought about the storeroom and the flour sacks and the number he had been carrying alone for 3 weeks, and he made a decision that was long overdue. He went back inside and started writing an honest inventory. By mid-December, the people of Harrow Flats were staying indoors for longer stretches. Fires burned through the night. Wood piles shrank at a rate that made men visit them more often than was comfortable. The wind found every imperfection in every structure on Fletcher Street, every loose board, every ill-fitted window frame, and used it with patience and precision. In the boarding house, Mabel Whitmore kept her stove burning around the clock and charged no extra. People gathered in her front room in the evenings because there was something in numbers that felt like warmth even when it wasn't. She was 64 years old and had seen hard winters before, though not this hard, and she watched her guests with the eyes of someone doing continuous triage, deciding who needed what and when. She did not mention Vivian Cross, but she thought about her. She thought about the woman who had packed clay into rock walls in August while everyone was laughing, and she thought about how warm the boarding house was, not even with the stove going full, and she did the arithmetic her way. She did not go to the bluff. Not yet, but she stopped laughing. Christmas Eve came in at a temperature that no one in Harrow Flats had a number for because the only thermometer in town was broken. Later, people would say it was 50 below. None of them argued the estimate because their bodies believed it completely. The air had a quality that had nothing to do with discomfort and everything to do with threat. Metal contracted and squealed. The ground transmitted cold upward through the soles of boots. Breath crystallized before it had fully left the mouth. Harlan Steed's chimney failed just before 10 o'clock in the evening. It did not fail dramatically. The ice that had been building in the upper flue over the previous 3 days finally closed the draft entirely, and the smoke, which had nowhere else to go, turned back into the house. It came in slowly at first, a ghost of it, then more, and Harlan woke from a half-sleep to the smell and the staying in his eyes and shouted for Ruth before he was fully upright. Ruth had the children out of their beds and into coats before he reached the hallway. She moved with the focused speed of a woman who has already in the back of her mind prepared for this. She got both children through the front door and into the street while Harlan went back for the poker to try to clear the flue from below, which he already knew was not going to work, but which he could not stop himself from trying. The smoke came down the poker's length and into his face, and he stumbled backward off the porch into the snow. He stood in the street outside his burning, smokeless house and looked at his children's faces in the dark and felt something he had not felt before in his 48 years of being a man who had things handled. He felt the specific quality of helplessness that arrives when competence runs out. "Burrell," he shouted it at the dark street. "Sheriff, I need help." Burrell was there faster than made senses, though he had been waiting to be needed, which in some way he had. 2 other men came with him. They tried the chimney from above, from the roof, one man going up with a length of chain to break the ice. The cold defeated the chain within minutes. They tried restarting the fire with the poker still in the flue to hold the draft open. The smoke came back harder. Ruth was shaking in a way that was no longer about temperature alone. She held her youngest against her chest, and Harlan watched her hands and saw that they were not steady and understood that they had run out of time to try anything else. Burrell turned to Harlan in the street with the absolute directness of a man who is done with indirection. "We go to Vivian's, now." Harlan looked at him. "Unless you have something else," Burrell said. The cold pressed in from every direction. Harlan's children were behind him, their faces small and serious above their coat collars. He opened his mouth and found it empty. Pride was something you wore when you could afford it. He could not afford it. "Which way?" he said. They were 4 steps down the street when Burrell stopped. There was a sound faint and wrong coming from the direction of the Calloway house. Or rather, what had been the Calloway house before the second storm had taken what the first had started. Burrell went toward it at a jog, Harlan behind him. The roof was mostly gone. What remained of the east wall was holding but barely, and sitting against the north wall with a blanket over her head and both arms wrapped around a bundle that was not making any sound was a woman Burrell had never expected to find there because he had assumed Nora Calloway was already safe. She had gone back that afternoon to retrieve what she could carry before the cold made it impossible, and the cold had moved faster than she had. He went in fast, knelt down, pulled the blanket back. Nora's eyes opened. The baby was against her chest, inside her coat, skin to skin. His color was wrong pale in a way that made Burrell's stomach drop, but when he put his hand near the small face, he felt breath faint and fast. "How long have you been here?" Burrell asked. Nora's mouth moved, but no words came. He did not wait for the answer. He got his arms under her and stood and turned to Harlan. "Take the baby, under your coat, against your chest. Move." Harlan had never in his life taken an infant he didn't know from someone he barely knew, in a collapsed house in the dark on the coldest night in memory. He did it without hesitating. The baby went inside his coat, and he felt the small, terrible fragility of the weight there, and he walked. The mile to the bluff was the longest mile Harlan Steed had ever walked. He had his own children behind him and someone else's child pressed against his chest, and his eyes were fixed on a single point ahead in the dark that grew slowly, almost impossibly slowly, into a thin line of yellow light leaking around the edges of a plank door set into the rock. He thought about July, about a woman loading sealed tins onto a wagon, about how easy the laughter had come. Burrell knocked, 3 hard blows. A voice from inside. "Who is it?" "Burrell, we have people in trouble." The latch moved. The door opened inward, and the warmth that came through the gap was not dramatic or overwhelming. It was simply steady and real and entirely unlike anything left standing in Harrow Flats that night. Vivian Cross looked at them. She took in Ruth's shaking hands and Harlan's coat and the shape of what was inside it, and Mabel Whitmore's dead weight on the back of the last man in the line because Burrell had found her on the ground 200 yards back, and Harlan had gone back for her without being asked, hoisting her onto the back of a man named Greer, who was larger and steadier on the snow. Vivian looked at all of it for exactly 1 second. "Get inside," she said, "all of you." She took the baby from Harlan's coat before he had finished crossing the threshold. She unwrapped the child with practiced hands, held him against her own warmth, checked his color and his breath. She handed him to Nora, who had been helped through the door by Burrell and who sank immediately onto the nearest surface. "Skin to skin," Vivian said. "Keep him inside your shirt. Don't stop." Nora did not answer. She just did it. Harlan stood near this door with melting snow dripping from his coat and looked at the room. The stove sat in the center, radiating heat that reached every wall. The woodpile along the left side was stacked with the careful density of someone who had been thinking about this moment since August. The stone walls were doing what Vivian had always known they would do, and the room was warm in a way that the wood frame houses of Harrow Flats had never been and could never be. He had laughed at this. He had stood in the July heat and laughed at the woman who built it. Ruth put her hand on his arm, and he could feel that her shaking had begun to slow. Vivian handed Ruth a cup without looking up from where she was crouching beside Nora. Ruth took it with both hands. "Thank you," she said barely above a whisper. Vivian looked up at Burrell. Her voice was level and without reproach, the voice of someone who has moved past every emotion that is not useful. "How bad is it in town?" "Bad," Burrell said, "and getting worse." "How many people?" "Could be everyone." Vivian stood. She looked at the open space in the center of the room, the floor she had left clear since August, the space that visitors had always taken for incompleteness. She looked at it and saw what it actually was, which was an answer she had built before anyone had thought to ask the question. "Go back," she said to Burrell. "Tell them anyone who needs heat comes here. Bring blankets if they have them. Tell them to move before the wind changes direction." She paused. "Go now." Burrell looked at Harlan. Harlan was already pulling his coat back on. They came before dawn. Harlan and Burrell had been back in town less than 40 minutes when the first family appeared at the base of the bluff, a man named Boyd Pruitt carrying his wife on his back because she had twisted her ankle on the ice and refused to be left behind. Behind them, 2 more shapes materialized from the dark, and then 3 more, and by the time the sky began to show the gray suggestion of morning, there was a line of people moving up the slope toward the cave with the slow, hunched determination of people who have set aside everything except the need to keep moving. Vivian stood at the door and opened it, and closed it and opened it again. Each time it opened, the cold came in hard and fast, and she stood in it without flinching, pointing people to spots on the floor with the economy of someone who has already run this particular problem in her head 100 times. "Blankets there. Keep the walkway clear. Children to the back room first. Anyone coughing, sit near the east wall where the steam from the kettle can reach you." She said each thing once. People did what she said. Nora Calloway, who had been in the cave long enough to know its rhythm, stood up from her place near the stove and began guiding the new arrivals to their spots without being asked. Her baby was strapped against her chest in a length of cloth, and she moved through the crowded space with the careful efficiency of someone navigating a ship's deck in rough weather. She had arrived as a woman in crisis. She had become, without ceremony or announcement, someone the cave needed. Vivian noticed. She said nothing. There was no time for it. By mid-morning, the count was past 70. By noon, it was at 100, and Amos Burrell counted it twice because the first number seemed impossible. He stood in the center of the main room and looked at the faces arrayed around him on the floor against the walls packed into the sleeping room, with bodies pressed close for additional warmth. And he thought about the open space Vivian had left in the middle of this room. Since August, the inexplicable empty floor that he had noticed and puzzled over and never quite understood until right now. She had not left it empty because she ran out of ideas. She had left it empty because she was expecting them. Mabel Whitmore sat against the east wall with a blanket across her knees and her back straight because Mabel Whitmore had not survived 64 Wyoming winters by slouching. She looked around the cave with the slow, appraising attention of someone taking inventory of a situation she had initially misjudged, and the inventory was giving her results she was not entirely comfortable with. The clay walls, the fitted door that sat in its frame without a gap, the wood pile that was still somehow substantial, the organized arrangement of tin food containers on the shelf Vivian had built. She had run a boarding house for 22 years. She understood logistics. What she was looking at was not the project of a grief-addled widow. It was the work of someone who had thought about what 100 people would need and then built it before those 100 people knew they were going to need it. She pulled her blanket tighter and said nothing because she was not yet ready to say out loud what she was thinking. The first real conflict erupted on the second afternoon when Ned Garrett decided that his comfort was more urgent than anyone else's. Ned was 23, the son of a man who had made enough money in cattle to give his boy the impression that the world arranged itself around him. He was not malicious. He was simply accustomed to outcomes that confirmed his centrality, and the cave was failing to provide that confirmation. He pushed his way to the spot closest to the stove, the warmest corner, the place where an older man named Walt Cutter had been sitting for the better part of 6 hours. Cutter did not say anything. He was a former miner somewhere north of 60, and his hands had the swollen knuckle joints of a man who had worked in cold water for too many years. He shifted without protest because he had long since learned that protesting cost more than moving. Burrell saw it and moved toward them. "Nobody pushes in here," Burrell said. Ned turned with the expression of someone who has been interrupted in something reasonable. "He's taking up the whole warm spot." Cutter's voice was thin and even. "My hands don't work right in the cold anymore." Vivian was across the room. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She looked at Ned the way you look at a calculation that has come out wrong and needs to be corrected. "Take that blanket and put it around his shoulders," she said. "Then sit against the north wall. You'll warm up." Ned looked at her. "Why should I be the one who—" "Because you want to see spring," Vivian said. The sentence landed and did not bounce. Ned picked up the blanket and draped it around Walt Cutter's shoulders with the careful movements of someone performing an action under observation, and then he went to the north wall and sat down with his arms crossed and his jaw set and said nothing. The room went on around him. Cutter looked at his covered shoulders and then at the wall where Ned sat and then at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has seen versions of this story before and knows how they usually end. That night, when the cave had settled into the particular shallow sleep of 100 people in an unfamiliar place, Vivian took her scrap of paper from the wall and did her count by the low light of the stove. She added the new number, ran the calculation forward. She sat down on the floor beside the woodpile with her back against the cold rock and looked at the result. The wood would last through the worst of it if they were careful. If. That word had never felt so heavy. She had planned for 60, perhaps 70 people. The math for 100 was different in ways that did not resolve cleanly. She would need to reduce the burn rate without letting the temperature drop to a point where the vulnerable people, the babies, the old ones, the sick, lost ground they could not recover. She sat with this for a long time. She did not wake Burrell. She did not ask anyone for help. She worked the problem alone, the way she had worked every problem for the past 14 months, going at it from different angles until she found the one that gave her a workable answer. 2 logs at a time instead of 3, 1 hour shorter between additions. Bank the fire deeper at night. It would mean the room ran cooler than she liked. It would mean the margins were thinner. But it would hold. She put the paper back and stood up. In the morning, she told Burrell quietly before the room was fully awake that she needed his patrol teams to bring back wood on every run into town as much as they could carry before anything else. Burrell looked at her face. He did not ask why. Done, he said. 2 logs now, Vivian said to the room when the fire needed feeding. 1 more in 2 hours. We don't burn tomorrow's heat tonight. No one argued. There was something in the way she said it that made argument feel beside the point, the same matter-of-fact authority with which she said everything, the voice of someone whose instructions came from calculation rather than preference. The days organized themselves around the stove and the kettle and the rhythm Vivian set. She assigned tasks not as orders, but as questions. Can you sew? Those coats need mending. Can you carve? We need more hooks for hanging things. Can you cook? Then you cook the next pot. She did not allow idleness. Idleness in a space this crowded was its own kind of cold. Silas Hewitt arrived on the 3rd day with a sack of flour on his shoulder and the expression of a man who has decided that shame is less useful than action. He set the sack down near Vivian's tin containers and straightened up and looked at her directly. I knew the stores were short, he said. I knew in November and I didn't say. Vivian was checking the beans in the pot. She did not look up immediately. I know, she said. I thought it might not be as bad as the number said. She looked up then. The number was right, Silas. Numbers usually are. It's the people looking at them who decide not to believe. He held her gaze. I'll manage the inventory from here. Whatever you have, I'll keep the count. You won't have to do that part alone. She studied him for a moment, this man who had watched her load tin boxes onto her wagon in July with an expression of polite bemusement. Then she nodded once the economy of acknowledgement she gave to everything that was correctly done. Don't hide the number again, she said, whatever it is. No, he said, I won't. He took the inventory sheet she handed him and sat down against the wall and began to work, and it was the most useful he had felt in weeks. On the 4th night, the wind came back. It was not the wind of the previous days which had been severe. This was something different in character, a sustained pressure that did not gust and drop, but simply bore down hour after hour with a consistency that felt personal. The canvas tarp over the cave mouth bellied inward and then held. The plank door pressed against its frame and held. The clay-packed walls did not move. 100 people lay in the dark and listened to the sound outside and waited for the cave to fail them. It did not fail them. A small girl named Ada Mabel Whitmore's granddaughter had been awake for most of the night. She found Vivian near the stove in the pre-dawn dark and stood beside her in silence for a moment before asking the question that was clearly the one keeping her awake. Are we going to die? Vivian crouched down so that her face was level with the child's. She did not reach for a reassuring lie. She looked at Ada the way she looked at everything, straight and without decoration. Not in here, she said. How do you know? Because I built this place like I meant it. Ada considered this with the seriousness of a child processing information she intends to keep. She nodded once and went back to her spot beside her grandmother, and Mabel Whitmore, who had been awake and listening, did not say anything. She put her arm around her granddaughter and looked across the room at Vivian's back and felt something that had no comfortable name, something between gratitude and a specific kind of regret that is only available to people who have been wrong about something that mattered. Ned Garrett came back to himself on the 5th day. He had been ill since the 3rd. The cough had started as something he could minimize and had become by the 4th night something he could not. Vivian had watched it develop with the attention she gave to all the medical situations in the cave, which was the quiet, methodical attention of someone who cannot afford to miss a change. On the morning of the 5th day, she was beside him when the coughing took him hard, and when it passed, she held up the cloth he had coughed into without commentary. There was blood on it, a small amount but unmistakable. Ned looked at it and went very still. It's not, he started. She held the cloth closer to the light. She did not speak. He sat back against the wall. The argument went out of him like air from a punctured thing. He was 23 years old, and he was looking at blood on a cloth in a cave in the worst winter anyone in this part of Wyoming could remember. And the woman holding the cloth had every reason to let him manage his own consequences. She did not. She boiled water and directed him to lean over the steam with a blanket over his head, breathing slowly for as long as he could hold it. She did this 3 times that day. Nora Calloway sat beside him during the 2nd session and held the edge of the blanket in place when his arms grew tired, her baby sleeping against her chest, her free hand steadying the cloth without being asked. Ned surfaced from the 3rd steam treatment and looked at Nora. You don't have to do this, he said. I know, after the way I acted. Nora shifted the baby to a more comfortable position. This is the place where people help each other, she said simply. Mrs. Cross does it, I follow her lead. Ned looked at his hands. He did not have an answer for that. He sat with it instead, which was a thing he had not previously been in the habit of doing. The following morning, he was the first person in the cave to wake up. He took the dull-headed axe from its place beside the door, went out into the sharp, still air of the early morning, while the wind had eased, and began splitting kindling. He had never chopped wood in any serious way in his life, and his technique was poor, but he was young and his arms were strong, and he worked steadily for an hour until Vivian appeared at the door to check the weather. She looked at the pile of kindling he had made. She looked at him. She went back inside without saying anything, but she left the door open. Reverend Cyrus Doane arrived on the seventh day. He came alone. There was no dramatic entrance and no announcement. He was simply there when Vivian opened the door on a supply check, standing in the cold with the specific stillness of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it, but is not entirely certain of his welcome. His appearance had changed. The coat that had always been pressed and presentable was stiff with dried snow along the shoulders. His beard, which he kept trimmed with precision, had gone ragged. He was 58 years old, and he looked it in a way he had not before. "The church's north wall cracked through," he said, "2 nights ago." Vivian looked at him for a moment that carried the full weight of everything that had been said and implied over the previous months. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. He came in. He stood inside the door for a moment and looked at the room at 100 people living in organized warmth in a space that he had on multiple occasions described to others as the project of an unwell mind. He found a place along the wall and sat down quietly and did not try to make himself central, which was for Cyrus Doane a considerable act. That evening, when the room had settled and Vivian was doing her last check of the woodpile, he crossed the space to where she stood and waited until she acknowledged him. "I told people you weren't well," he said. "After Edmund. I said it more than once." "I know," Vivian said. She was counting. "I believed I was being pastoral. I understand now that I was being convenient. It was easier to explain what you were doing as grief than to consider that you might be right." She stopped counting. She turned and looked at him fully, the way she looked at problems that required actual attention. "I don't need an apology, Edmund." He held her gaze. "I know. I'm not sure an apology is adequate anyway." "It isn't." She was quiet for a moment. "When this is over, use that pulpit to tell people that preparing for hard times isn't a failure of faith, that taking care of your neighbor means something physical. It means stacked wood and sealed walls and food put by. If you can do that, then this conversation is finished." Doane looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face that had been held tight for a long time came loose. "I can do that," he said. She nodded and went back to her count. The hard cold broke in the last week of January. It did not break dramatically. The temperature moved from unbearable to merely severe, and then from severe to painful, and then one morning Amos Burrell walked outside and came back in with something different in his face. 20 below, he said. Someone groaned. Burrell held up a hand. 3 weeks ago, it was 50. We're climbing. Vivian kept the fire steady. She kept the soup pot full. When people began talking about going back to town, she was direct. 1 more week. The walls and the chimneys need to be checked before anyone sleeps in those houses. You go back too soon and you undo everything we've held on to. Harlan organized the check teams. He did not wait to be asked. He took Ned and 2 other men, and they went through Harrow Flats house by house, clearing chimneys, checking wall integrity, marking the houses that needed work before they were habitable. They came back each evening with a report and a list, and Vivian read the list and added it to the inventory she was keeping of what the town would need to do when the full thaw came. On the evening of this day, they declared the last house cleared. Harlan came and stood near Vivian while she was banking the fire for the night. He had been waiting to say something for over a week, and she knew it, and she had let him wait because the timing had not been right until now. "Viv," he said. She did not look up from the fire. "I called you crazy. I stood in the street and made people laugh at you. I was proud when I should have been paying attention." He stopped. His voice was working harder than it usually did. "You saved my kids. You saved Ruth. You saved this whole damn town." She set down the poker and turned around. Harlan Steed's eyes were wet, and he knew she could see it, and he was past the point of caring. He was 48 years old, and he was standing in a cave that a woman he had dismissed as unhinged had built with her own hands to keep people like him alive, and there was nothing left to do with that fact except stand in it. "You want to do something about it?" Vivian said. He blinked. "When the thaw comes," she said, "you help rebuild this town the right way. Better stoves, sealed walls, A communal wood store, a real inventory kept honest checked every fall. You make sure nobody has to run to a cave again. Yes, he said, without hesitation. All of it, not just your place. All of it. She looked at him for a long moment with the steady, unsentimental attention she brought to every honest thing. Then she said, "Good, now sit down. There's still soup." He sat. He ate. Across the room, Ruth watched the two of them and felt something release in her chest that had been tight since July when she had watched her husband laugh at a woman loading tin boxes onto a wagon and had not said the thing she should have said, which was that the woman loading the boxes was probably right. The town meeting happened in the saloon in the first week of February because the church still had a cracked wall and the schoolhouse had a roof that needed replacing before it could hold anyone. Vivian walked through the door, and the room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the person who has earned the silence enters. Harlan stood up. He used her full name the way a man uses a full name when he wants it to have weight. Vivian Cross. Hattie Finch stood up beside him. We were cruel. Silas Hewitt cleared his throat. We were cowards about things that mattered. Mabel Whitmore, seated near the back because her ankle was still tender from the fall, said it the plain way she said everything. We were wrong. Amos Burrell, leaning against the wall by the door, said the last part. And we are alive because you opened your door. The room was very still. Vivian stood at the front of it and looked at the faces. She had looked at these same faces for 7 weeks in a cave, watched them sleep and argue and help each other and cry quietly in the dark and tell stories and share food they were not sure would stretch far enough. She had watched Harlan Steed go back out into a blizzard to find Mabel Whitmore lying in the snow. She had watched Ned Garrett split kindling in the cold dawn with bad technique and complete commitment. She had watched Nora Calloway hold a blanket in place for a man who had pushed her aside because that was the kind of place Vivian had made, and Nora had decided to keep it that way. She had built a cave. These people had made it something else. All right, she said. And then because there was more to say, and this was the moment to say it, she said it. My husband was going to fix the gap in our north wall before March. He didn't get the chance. I am not smarter than anyone in this room. I am not braver. I am just someone who learned what the word later actually costs and who decided she was not willing to pay it again. She paused. Now you've all learned it too, so don't waste it. The room held that for a moment. Then Harlan said, we start on the communal wood store next week. I've already got the timber. Doan stood up from his seat near the back. Every head in the room turned. He had the focused stillness of a man who has prepared what he is about to say and believes it without reservation. I owe this town a correction, he said. I spent months suggesting that Mrs. Cross's preparations were the behavior of someone who wasn't thinking clearly. I was wrong, and I said so to her privately, but I am saying it here because that is where the damage was done. He looked around the room. Taking care of your neighbor is not only prayer, it is also wood. It is sealed walls and honest inventory, and the willingness to do the hard, uncomfortable work before the emergency rather than after it. I intend to say that plainly from now on. I should have said it long ago. The silence afterward was different from the silences that had come before it. It had the texture of something genuinely changed. Spring arrived the way it always did in Wyoming, reluctantly and without apology, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, while the north sides held on for another few weeks. The mud that replaced the snow was profound and universal, and everyone complained about it, and everyone was glad to see it. Vivian stood outside the cave on a morning in late March when the air had for the first time something tentative and soft in it. Below the rooftops of Harrow Flats were visible through the last of the haze, and she could see the new wood store frame going up on the east side of town. Harlan's crew already at it before 8 in the morning. Burrell rode up the slope on his bay horse, picking his way through the mud, and stopped below her. You did it, he said. We did it. He looked at the town below them. You started it. She was quiet for a moment. I just didn't stop. He smiled the kind of smile that doesn't need anything added to it. Then he said, you ever going to let them forget what happened? She looked at the framing going up on the wood store, at the chimney work visible on 3 houses being properly rebuilt, at the smoke rising straight and clean from flues that had been cleared and checked and would be checked again before October. They can forget the cold, she said. People always do, but I won't let them forget what they built because of it. Burrell nodded and turned his horse back down the slope. Hattie Finch started coming by in April, riding out on Tuesday mornings with coffee in a flask and news from town in the easy companionship of a woman who had decided that proximity to Vivian Cross was something she had been wrong to avoid for 2 years. They sat on the bench outside the cave mouth and watched the light move across the flats and talked about nothing and everything the way women talk when they have stopped needing to prove things to each other. One morning, Hattie said without preamble, "We used to think you were lonely out here." Vivian looked at the view. "Maybe I was." "Are you still?" Vivian thought about the question the way she thought about things that deserved actual consideration. She thought about the bench she was sitting on, which Ned Garrett had built from spare timber, one afternoon without announcing he was going to do it, or asking if she wanted it, just built it and left it and gone home. She thought about Nora, who came every week with her baby, who was healthy and growing, and had started to smile at Vivian in a way that suggested he had decided she was someone safe. She thought about Mabel Whitmore, who had sent a jar of preserved peaches down with Burrell last week with a note that said, "Only well done," in her particular small handwriting. She thought about Edmund's journal on the shelf beside the stove. She had not moved it. She did not intend to. "Not the way I was," she said. Hattie poured more coffee into both cups and did not push for more because it was enough. That summer, Vivian still rose before dawn and went outside with her axe. Not from fear. She had made her peace with a particular thing that fear had built in her, which was something more durable than fear and less exhausting to carry. She chopped wood because it was the right time of year to chop wood, because October came, whether or not you were ready, because the people she now considered her neighbors had families and old bones and newborn children, and she intended to be useful to them in the most concrete way she knew how. She counted the wood when she was done. She always would. The sound of the axe carried down into Harrow Flats on still mornings, and the people who heard it had stopped finding it peculiar sometime around January. Now, when they heard it, they went about their morning with something quiet and steady, underneath the ordinary sounds of the day, the way a person goes about their morning differently when they know someone reliable is awake and keeping watch. Nobody laughed at the sound of an axe anymore. They heard it and knew what it meant, which was the same thing it had always meant, the thing Vivian Cross had known since the morning she stood in a cave with her hand against the warm rock and decided to stop saying later. It meant someone was making sure.